Haven't seen Wild and Reckless till you get over to Europe, where they build on that and just really exaggerate. Here's Niels Peter Lamech at the University of Copenhagen. Archaeological data have now definitely confirmed that the empire of David and Solomon never existed. Now, how does archaeological data confirm that something never existed? You could confirm something did exist, but maybe you find something tomorrow that confirms it that you haven't found today, and so anyway, that's another story. Jane Cahill, the successor, at least publisher of Shiloh's material, is likewise a courageous individual who's fighting back. And in Biblical Archaeological Review 2004, she says the most frequently voiced argument by those who challenge the historical existence of the United Monarchy is a supposed, and I'd underscore supposed, lack of archaeological evidence. Now, you don't find the Palace of David with all the cedar planks in this huge structure, monumental buildings that were destroyed by Babylonians and by Romans, but still it's appropriate to say it is a supposed lack of evidence. In most cases, she continues saying these arguments are either grossly misleading, illogical, disingenuous, or all three. Now you might think, well, she's a little over the top here in her response, but let's look at the evidence first before you make that judgment and see if that kind of a statement is justified. What's the evidence for this city of David? We're looking here at the Temple Mount, and the triangular area just south of the Temple Mount was the area that was occupied by the Jebusites, and that's referred to as the city of David. The earliest reference to this city is from the Amarna letters that date back to the 14th century BC. This is considerably, I believe, before the Exodus. And here is a letter from the ruler of Jerusalem to the Egyptian Pharaoh. And in the inset here, the white boxed letters, you see reference to Jerusalem before the Exodus. After, of course, the Exodus, after David and his people arrived, then we likewise see evidence. This is the way it has been reconstructed. This is the way they believe it appeared at the time David arrived on the scene. We see the irrigation system over on the right-hand side. I think the Pool of Siloam down at the bottom. Up at the top, we see the temple that was ultimately built by Solomon, and David's palace there below that. The thing that came under first investigation by Cahill and by others was the area that's referred to as the stepped structure that the arrow is pointing to. Obviously, something is going on here. Cahill tried to say it was built by numbers of different people over hundreds of years. Shiloh refuted that by sinking the square shaft that you see up at the top, and with that shaft showed that the whole thing was interconnected and interdependent and had to be built at the same time, not over long periods, but was built by the Jebusites and was there at the time David arrived. On the foot of this sloping stepped structure, which is the foundation of obviously something that had to be really big. What needs that kind of a foundation? It's been estimated maybe a 6-story building. I mean, well, you wouldn't need that much foundation without it. On the foot, you see later buildings, and this dates back to the end of the First Temple period, just before the Babylonians marched in. And especially in one of these structures on the foot, the later structures, you have what's referred to as the archive building, for good reason. Important papers were kept here. Well, the papers were burned. They're not available to us. But the papers were sealed with a clay seal stamped by a signet ring or by a stamp of the official that was sending this important document. And this is where a number of them were stored because you find a lot of the seals. And when it's burned, actually the fire fires the clay and helps preserve it. 51 of these stamps, referred to as bully, have been found from this archive building that dates to the time of the end of the First Temple period, right at the time when the Babylonians came in and burned it. As we pointed out, these seals are often used to date things, and you see the thing that did the impressing on the left-hand side and the stamped clay that's been fired on the right-hand side. 51 of these were found, and as they began to look and read what they said, it was astounding. Here's one from Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, that's mentioned in 1 Chronicles 9. This was a member of the family of high priests who officiated at the end of the First Temple period. Then we read of Jeremiah, the son of Shaphan. He's one of the scribes, a high official in the court of Jehoiakim, who was the king at the time that the Babylonians came marching in, reigned at the end of the First Temple period. Then Baruch, mentioned in the same verse, if you're familiar with Jeremiah, this was his scribe. He's mentioned some 26 times by Jeremiah, and we have two of Baruch's seals. Actually, one of them has his thumbprint in the back of it. This rather liberal, I'd say semi-liberal, archaeology book, published in 98, Archaeology in the Old Testament, says this lump of clay used to close a papyrus document was sealed by none other than Baruch, the son of Neriah, specifying here Jeremiah 36 and 4. Then the king's son, who gave the orders to seize Jeremiah, to throw him into the pit, Jeremiel, his seal. I mean, these were the kinds of people that would have documents with their stamp on them, and that's what we find in this archive building. The king's son is there. Actually, of the 51 bulli that were found, they attest to 26 mentioned in the Bible. 26 out of the 51 you have reference to. And of course, the Bible would be describing the officials of the court. And wow, how do you get greater, more obvious confirmation that the Bible knows what it's talking about when it describes these people? Let's move back in history to the water shaft that's mentioned that Joab went up to conquer the city. 1 Samuel chapter 5. Whoever goes up, climbs up by the way of the water shaft, defeats the Jebusite. There's been a lot of questions about this and some things that were proposed as the water shaft that really weren't. But there was an irrigation system, a spring, we'll look at that in just a moment, in the city of Jerusalem. And water from that spring ran down the outside edge, and then there were holes that allowed the water to go out into the fields to irrigate. Well, Joab went through one of those holes, came up that water shaft, and then into the city. Today, you can walk right down that water shaft, as my wife is doing here. And if you travel over there, this is one of the things you want to do, just like Joab did. The water comes from the Gihon Springs, which is, of course, mentioned numerous times in the Bible. It provides water for the city of Jerusalem, one of the few sources of water in Israel. And it's a very prolific spring. Mentioned in 2 Chronicles 32, it was Hezekiah who stopped the upper outlet of the waters of the Gihon and directed it to the west side of the city. They, of course, now occupy the city, and here comes Sennacherib, ready to attack the city, the Assyrian king. And, okay, maybe they're going to come up the water shaft like Joab did. So we've got to protect this. And he did so with an outer wall and by redirecting the water back to the western side of the city. Well, you look there at the spring and you can see the shaft that was cut where it's pointed toward the west side of the city. And we'll see where that shaft goes in just a moment. But there at Gihon, there was a tower that was surrounding it that formed a large area where Solomon was coronated. And we look to 1 Kings chapter 1. The king said, this is King David, take with you the servants of the Lord, have my son Solomon ride on my own mule and bring him down to Gihon, where the springs are. Let Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet anoint him. They blow the trumpet. Here's a big ceremony they're going to have. And it would be in this restored area in the center of this area pointed to by the arrow. That's where the spring is, and these towers were built around it to protect the spring. Well, they're not really towers. There's really just one tower, we have found out now since this picture was drawn. Where is this area where the coronation took place? There was a little room about 8 by 12 that the archaeologists said this is all it could be. David Alid is one of the archaeologists who's working there with us in the city of David, was listening to one of the tour guides say this and thinking about what he read in Scripture. There were mules in here. There was the prophets. There was a big ceremony. In this little room, this just doesn't make any sense. And he just kind of went berserk, they thought. Grabbed up a sledgehammer and started beating on a wall. He says there has to be more than this. And the wall was actually built, that he was beating on, by Queen Helena some 300 years after Christ. She's the mother of Constantine that made a lot of messes over there. He broke the wall down, and it opened up into this huge area, not quite as big as this auditorium, but close. Certainly room for several mules in the ceremony that they're talking about, as would be reflected in the area that you're looking at here. That's inside that area, there at the spring of Gihon. Water was also stored from the spring at a pool that we have determined dates back to the time of Melchizedek. But at the time Sennacherib came, they decided to fill it in, because this was to protect the water from anyone who would be coming, and that's militarily significant. We were involved in helping to excavate that pool, which had been filled in by King Hezekiah, and you see all kinds of pottery and artifacts, idols, from the time of Hezekiah. And at this point we see my son in the center, and then a broken idol that he found at the excavation there. There's several of them have been. Every one of the idols that have been found were broken. Many of the jars are intact, many of the oil lamps are intact, but all of the idols are. Well, Hezekiah didn't get along well with the idolaters, did he? He helped destroy, break down the idols, and he broke the idols before he piled them into the pool. This is the south end of a northbound calf, which they typically worshipped. The text says he diverted the water to the west side of the city, and we saw this little outlet there from the spring that headed to the west side. Again, 2 Chronicles 32, he stopped the waters of Gihon, directed them to the west side, and made the pool and the conduit, brought the water into the city. This is a diagram of what we're looking at. Here's the Gihon spring there in red, and the dark blue line is the tunnel that Hezekiah dug to redirect the water from the original course indicated by the light blue line, which he then protected by an outer wall, as we'll see. But the water then went down this dark blue line. It was through a tunnel that he dug. Well, you can walk down those tunnels that are described in Scripture as being built by Hezekiah, and there's an inscription that was found several years ago that described how the tunnel was built. This is a picture of it. It describes beginning from either end, and as they approached, they could hear each other, and they finally met as axe was against axe. It gives the length of the tunnel. It's there, just like the Scriptures would indicate, and as confirmed by the inscription. That tunnel continued down to the pool of Siloam, the text says in Scripture. Well, here's this little bitty pool that the tunnel goes to. Now, that was a puzzle, because the pool of Siloam ought to be more significant than this, and it's just a little dinky thing that you can see here in this picture that the tunnel does go to, and the Scripture says, okay, it goes to the tunnel, but this is not much of a pool. And actually what's built around it is Byzantine. It's not really that old. What we found was that that's not the pool of Siloam. This blue, light blue area lower is a much larger pool. It's well over an acre that we found in 2004. But wait a minute, the tunnel doesn't go down to the big pool. Well, yes, it does. We found out last summer, as we helped excavate. The tunnel just kept right on going past that little bitty dinky thing that they've been saying is the pool of Siloam for years, to the big pool. Let's go back up to the Gihon Springs, where there were towers built around to provide it. And that tower, I think, is referred to in Scripture in Luke chapter 13, but it's pointed to here by the arrow. And remember, Jesus said, do you suppose these 18 on whom the tower fell and killed were worse culprits than all the men did? 18 people were killed here, And sure enough, we found where that tower had fallen, and these huge stones that were probably laid there by the Jebusites